You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hi, gang. Welcome to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. I'm John Tyerman.
And it's Mark Wainwright. John, good to see you today. And we're going to talk a little bit about prospecting. Scary word, yes.
We digging for gold?
Yeah, maybe.
Mark, I'm excited about this one because you shared an example of a 2-week multi-channel prospecting sequence. It's chock full of research, social media, email, phone calls. There's a bunch of different touch points on this sample 14-day sequence that I think our listeners will get a lot of value of.
Prospecting conjures these visions of cold calls in people's minds, and that may be the phone, that strange little thing where you talk to people might actually be a part of this. But the hope is that people embrace prospecting as an important part of your lead generation toolkit. I think that's why we're going to do this.
So let's break it down. Mark, from your perspective, how would you define prospecting? What is it?
I refer to prospecting as proactive outreach to individuals to uncover new opportunities. And prospecting is undertaken by individual doer-sellers. If we're talking about a lot of the folks that I am connected to and work with in professional services firms, people who are full-time sales people do a lot of prospecting. So it's that individual proactive outreach where you're trying to create these one-to-one connections.
I think that's a good, succinct definition. And if we're thinking about our sales and marketing continuum, which we've referenced on past episodes, where do you think prospecting lies on this continuum?
Well, since it's definitely one-to-one activities, it's, from my perspective, it's definitely on the sales end. So it's probably a number 4. 5 is all sales. 4 would be sort of sales-led and marketing supported. And I think it's a 4, but the reality is that prospecting can't happen without great support from a marketing team with content and different types of channels that you can use for outreach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, I think it's a 4 on that 1 to 5 marketing to sales continuum. But to me, it's the definition of a really healthy marketing and sales partnership.
Excellent. What we're going to do on this episode is, first, we're going to quickly define a few different key terminologies that we're going to be using. And then we're going to talk about why prospecting is critical for professional services firms. And then we're going to go into the objectives of prospecting, different outcomes you can expect from prospecting. And then along the way, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how marketing can support. So,
great.
Let's start defining what we mean by prospects, leads, and opportunities, specifically those 3 parts.
Good. So yes, prospects, leads, opportunities. And these words come up again and again in conversations like this, and podcasts and articles and all over the place. And a lot of times they're a little bit confused. And I think John and I, even you, have come at this with slightly different viewpoints and definitions. But leads, we'll start with a lead, right? A lead is a yet to be qualified new business opportunity. It could come in through a website. It could be someone that you meet at a conference or an event, grab somebody's business card. There's a lead, right? They haven't gone through any vetting, any qualification, right? And a lead is associated with an individual. So you can consider, John Smith that you met at a conference. You got John's business card, but you're not really sure if this is a real opportunity or not. Opportunities are qualified leads. They've gone through a vetting process. There's a need there. They fit your ideal client profile. You have a good sense that you can be mutually successful together. So this is going to be a new business opportunity that's going to enter into your sales pipeline, and you're going to walk it through your sales process. Prospects are individuals that you proactively identify as sort of pre-qualified, potentials, right? So hopefully if you can do prospecting where you're reaching out to these pre-qualified, identified people that fit into your ideal client profile, and you can connect with them, and we'll talk about how that is done. Then there's a bit of vetting and qualification that's already been done. So if enter into a conversation with them and say, yeah, this whatever you have to offer might actually be a good fit for us. They are a qualified lead. Now they are an opportunity in your sales pipeline. So it's a proactive way to generate sort of these good fits, pre-qualified, pre-vetted leads that are going to jump right into your sales pipeline. I don't know. What's your spin on that, John?
Yeah, the way you explained it, Mark, makes sense to me. And there's a level of pre-qualification that happens when you're identifying prospects. And to me, a lead is someone who has expressed some level of interest, and maybe they're not qualified. They need to go through that qualification process before they can be converted into an opportunity. So I was a little murky about this, but then after, we had a conversation a little back and forth in preparing for this episode, it brought me a little clarity on how to think about this. So I used to think about it a little linearly, where prospect, lead, then opportunity. But I guess it's not as linear as that, where the method in which you create opportunities can be different, right? And so it could flow from an outbound prospecting sequence, or it could flow from an inbound lead generation. So I think that's an interesting point and a good segue into our next section about why professional services firms should do prospecting. Sure, you should absolutely be investing in marketing and an inbound lead flow for when there is demand in the market, you're set up to capture it. But you also need to complement that with outbound motions so that you can uncover hidden demand out there in the marketplace.
I totally agree. The marketing team, the activities they're leading, should hopefully be generating some interest, some attention, and then ultimately some leads that come knocking at the door, ideally, right? That's an ideal situation, and that shows your marketing engine is working well. Your individual salespeople, and in professional services firms, a lot of times, these are doer-sellers, people who are balancing doing the work with getting the work. These people should build and work that prospecting muscle, right? So that they can lead these proactive outreach efforts to generate some of their own new business.
There's doer-sellers. It's funny, Mark, I've always heard it seller-doer, but then I hear you saying doer-seller. Just a quick aside, is there any intention behind that?
From my perspective, it's just naturally the way people prioritize things.
Yeah. Okay.
The folks that I work with, the vast majority of their time they spent doing, and there's a little bit on the tail end that's selling. But you know what? Honestly, I don't know if a lot of people or sort of organizations, create these big differentiations between the two. But yeah, these are people who in general are splitting time, and by and large, they're spending most of their time doing, billable client work, inside the craft, and then some smaller percentage of time going out and getting.
But your point is that there is some time that needs to be spent on lead generation. There is some time that needs to be spent on business development, and prospecting is a big part of that.
This point, I think, is important, that it is targeted and proactive, so you can be very sort of precise in, who you want to be reaching out to, the types of conversations you want to be having, the types of clients you want to be bringing into your organization. That is the power of really good prospecting, is that it is very targeted. So you can control the types of new business that are coming to your organization very precisely. Whereas, if you are just constantly in this sort of lead flow where you've got new opportunities coming from all directions, your ability to filter and direct that is much less. So that's what I love about a good prospecting engine inside an organization, is that you can take control of your future business by being hyper-targeted with these outbound proactive activities.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. And I think that ties back to, a lot of firms typically, in my experience, use the end of the calendar year for a lot of their strategic planning. And we did an episode on that recently. For folks that are listening, go check that out. But if through that strategy, you find that there are different service lines that have higher margins, or you have capacity for new clients of a particular type, those insights can be applied to your prospecting list so that you can curate prospects that fit the types of work that you want. So that's a really important point, Mark.
Yeah. I think it's key. In a lot of cases, we've got these doer-seller individuals that don't have a ton of time. Like, they're not doing this all the time. So they have to be really efficient and effective with the limited time they have to do prospecting. So they can't waste time doing outreach to, hundreds of potential people all across this broad spectrum. They have to be hyper-targeted.
While it's kind of like a push and pull approach, with you can attract demand through your marketing, and you can uncover demand with prospecting. And so that's kind of what I want to dig into a little bit. Mark, you've got an analogy of an iceberg, and I think this is a really great analogy for people to kind of picture in their mind the impact of prospecting. So can you walk us through this iceberg analogy?
Sure. The picture of an iceberg, and how we use that analogy a lot of times, is that the vast majority of the iceberg is below the waterline. So most of an iceberg isn't visible. And so there's three parts, and I've taken this from a guy named Todd Capone, wrote a book called The Transparency Sale. It's a great book. Todd's on LinkedIn. He's active. He's a good source of sort of, humble, practical, I think, sort of sales content. So he breaks your potential world of clients, potential clients, down into three parts. One is that visible part of the iceberg that's above the waterline, and those are people who are actively buying. He uses that term, the actively buying. And those are folks who are out there looking for potential clients. Maybe they've created and they've put out into the world requests for proposals. So they are actively looking, right? So that's the first one. The second one is buyers who are passively buying, that maybe they're not in that active sort of request for proposal phase, but they've maybe recognized some needs in the organization, but the motivation or the urgency just hasn't set in yet. And the third one he puts into a bucket called status quo. And status quo is people, they have not defined a need. They're not looking for it. They think everything that's currently happening in the organization is okay. So those are the three, right? So we've got the actively buying above the waterline, then below the waterline, passively buying, and status quo. Now, there's pluses and minuses to all of those. A lot of people think, okay, so I'm gonna want to find the individuals who are actively buying, right? Because they're ready to go, right? The problem with approaching an organization who is actively buying, or at least getting into a conversation with them about some potential contract, is that they've likely clearly internally defined a lot of what their needs are, what they need to have done. They're probably cost sensitive, and your opportunity to kind of guide and mold and sort of co-create some potential solution is minimal, because they're saying, look, this is what we need. We just need somebody to do it, and we don't want to pay a lot, right? That's the downside of someone who's actively buying.
You're late to the conversation, right?
Yeah, you're late to the conversation, right? They've already, maybe they've worked with somebody externally to help them define that need, or maybe they've come up with it, internally, maybe accurately or inaccurately, but either way, they've already defined what they potentially need. Like I said, they could be wrong, but they've already figured that out. Now, but there's a bunch of opportunity below the waterline. So people who are passively buying, who are thinking, yeah, we might need something, but we're not really sure about how big, how much, how just they've got a lot of questions. So therein lies a wonderful opportunity for you to engage with them and co-create some solution. They're open to exploring ideas and options. They're, what ultimately, some desired future state, this vision of success that they need hasn't been created yet. So you can help them sort of create that. And then the last one I mentioned is that status quo group, people who are content with their situation. They're not really aware of any problems, but maybe they're just open to a conversation where you can kind of plant the seed and say, hey, here's something that we're seeing with a lot of the organizations very similar to you that we work with. What are your thoughts on that? So maybe you can start to grow that relationship. So those are the three sort of buckets that he puts them in. And the thing to keep in mind here is that actively buying group, they're a tough group. They've already defined their needs. They're price sensitive. And there's only a little bit of that iceberg sticking above the water. There's a whole bunch of other buyers out there in the world that are not visible below the waterline.
Okay, Mark, I'm gonna attempt to quantify this a little bit. So, but first, what we have to do, okay, open the door. We're gonna get in our time machine. Okay, we're gonna go back about 70 plus years. We're gonna go back to the 1950s, and there is a social psychology professor at Harvard University during this time. His name is Robert F. Bales, and Professor Bales studied market research. He's one of the godfathers of market research. Through his research, he found that there are three segments to any given market at any time.
Sounds familiar. This sounds familiar.
They line up exactly to the three buckets you're talking about.
Yeah.
The folks that are actively buying. This represents about 3% of the market at any given time. So if you think about that, whatever market you're in, whether you're selling architecture services, whether you're selling accounting services, consulting services, your target market, only about 3% of them are in the market for your services, are actively buying at any given time. The dissatisfied with the status quo, so this is your passively buying group, that represents about 40% of the market.
Right.
And then finally, the satisfied with their status quo, those that are not actively buying, those that are satisfied with their current solution, that represents about 57% of the market.
Huge.
Yep. Yeah, so that's where marketing can help support that 57%. And then if you think about our marketing and sales continuum, that would be more of the ones and twos. And then the dissatisfied with the status quo, those that are passively buying, that's really where there's an orchestration between marketing and sales that needs to happen. And then those that are actively on a buying journey, that's where your salespeople can step in and close the deal.
Perfect. We're going to walk through some objectives and outcomes and a little bit of a process here. But one thing I want to make sure I interject, just push the pause button for a second and say, look, prospecting is difficult, particularly for people who are, these doer-seller individuals who are experts in their craft. They are, really good, marketing consultants or accountants or engineers. And when they undertake something, when someone hands them a job to do, they get it done really well all the time, right? Prospecting, you're not always successful all the time. It can be a little bit frustrating. So what I want to do is walk through a little bit of a process that helps people balance their day job, right? Their engineering work, their architecture work, whatever else, with doing some of these prospecting activities. I want to hopefully kind of incent people to think, okay, so if I'm going to do this well, I need to focus. So I'm going to put aside my other work and I'm really going to focus on this just for a little bit of time. And that other thing we talked about is that prospecting is a fantastic way for people to control this whole ambiguous, confusing marketing and selling thing, right? So people to actually kind of get their hands wrapped around it and take control of it a little bit. So those are three important points I want to make. This is hard stuff, but ultimately, the benefits are great.
So what should doer-sellers, what should they be focused on? What are the different objectives for prospecting?
Yeah. So prospecting is not always kind of a win or lose situation. If you do it, you're unsuccessful with it, you kind of blew it, right? So I think there's three ways and I think this is a really healthy mindset. So there's three kind of layers of things you're trying to achieve, right? Ultimately, like if everything works out great, the big objective with prospecting is to get a conversation, get another conversation, right? You interact with someone, they say, yeah, great, let's take some time and talk, right? That's primary objective. Secondary from that is if you fail to get a meeting, at least you've learned some stuff, right? You've emailed back and forth with someone, you've done some research. They said, look, we don't have a specific need right now. It's an interesting offer. The timing doesn't seem to be right. Maybe get back to me in 6 months or whatever it is. Or this isn't a good fit for us, but I know someone who might find this to be really interesting, right? So you gather information. Good. And your last sort of fallback objective here is that you've established in some familiarity with them, right? They've seen your name, they've seen your company name come across in their inbox or through social media or whatever it is. So you've taken their familiarity of your name, your brand, et cetera, from maybe 0 to something above that. So those are 3 sort of layers of what you're going to get out of this. It's not always going to be another conversation, but you're always making positive progress in one of those 3 areas. When I talk about outcomes, right, if you actually get that conversation, there's three possible sort of outcomes of that specific conversation, right? Great, let's have a conversation next week. Super. All right. So you have that conversation, and even though you try to do your filtering and you're pre-vetting and trying to, think, okay, these guys are a really strong potential fit for us. You have your conversation, and they end up not being a really good fit, right? So they're great. There's not a there. This is not an opportunity, right? They come off of our list, right? We vetted them, filtered them. They're not going to be a good fit. Second, maybe they're a really good fit, but the timing is a little bit off. So again, you're going to put them on that other list that says, okay, call me back, again, right? We've made a connection. Let's talk. Third, and the most ideal situation is that you've had a conversation. They have a need. They've gone through that vetting, that filter. They're qualified, and we're going to put them in the pipeline as an opportunity, right? So if you are successful in getting the conversation, there's 3 potential outcomes of that conversation. Hopefully they turn into a new business opportunity, and you've done your research, done your homework, and said, these guys are a great fit. But if they aren't, you find that out now and you pull them off the list, and maybe if there's a need down the road, you'll stay in touch with them. So those are 3 of the outcomes that you can kind of achieve through this whole process.
Just to recap for our listeners, the 3 objectives for prospecting is to schedule that subsequent conversation. That's objective number 1. If you can't achieve that, it's okay, because there are other valuable impacts that prospecting can have on your business. You can gather information about these prospects, and you can establish and grow your familiarity with them through a series of different touch points. And then there are 3 possible outcomes. Either they're not a good fit and they're removed from the list, or they're a good fit, they have a potential need, but the timing is off, or the third potential outcome is they are a fit, they're qualified, and they're added to your pipeline.
Yep. All right. So let's dig into this kind of how-to, right?
Let's do it.
This little model. So I break it into 3 different parts: targets, tools, and technique, right?
Ooh, I love the alliteration.
Yeah, there you go. I'm big on the alliteration. So first part, targets are segmented lists. Obviously, targets are individuals that you want to start to bucket into these segmented lists, into these groups of similar types of individuals. And again, we're talking about people here. We're doing this outreach to individuals. We're not doing outreach to organizations. So we're trying to do research, identify, and then organize individuals on these lists. And John, you're a huge, proponent. I know marketing hangs its hat on the critical nature of the ideal client profile. And this is part of it. These lists should line up with ideal client profile or profiles that you've developed.
When you segment your ideal client profiles into different segments, what you can do is you can create messaging that resonates more with specific segments. So let's say you've got a couple different offers, and one offer is more aligned with one segment than another, then you might change your the messages that you use in your prospecting sequences based on the segment that you're going after.
Mm-hmm. Good. These groups are your segmented lists. And what can happen a lot of times is that if you have these different groups that fall under maybe slightly different ideal client profiles, you can use different approaches, different content, different information to kind of get in touch with them. And once you've got them grouped, and maybe an individual doer-seller is thinking about this, so like Mark is telling me to take hundreds of people and put them into buckets. That's not what I'm saying, right? I think realistically, if you are an individual, if you're an architect or a consultant, then part of your job is to go and uncover some new opportunities out there. You should be thinking, okay, I'm going to put 5 or 6 people in this one bucket, and I've got another 8 or so I'm going to put in this other bucket. So I've got this handful of really manageable individuals that I can walk through an outreach sequence, this prospecting sequence, and I can do it in a reasonable amount of time, and I can hopefully achieve what I want to achieve. So we're not recommending that you take your marketing list of 2,500 emails and then go at it, right? That's marketing's job.
That's marketing's job. Yeah.
That's marketing's job, right? Just scope wise, we're talking about a handful of people that you can get your head wrapped around and approach this whole process kind of in a reasonable way that you can balance with your billable work and your proactive outbound outreach. So that's what we're talking about. We'll put these people into different buckets, and then we have to prioritize those different groups, right? Here's a group that's you're going to work on first. There's 4 or 5 people in that group, and there's another group that you can work on next. So just to keep yourself organized, get them in buckets, prioritize everything. And then we move to step number 2, which is the tools. What tools are you going to use when you are doing your proactive outreach? And I know that, John, all of a sudden you turn to the marketing group, and the marketing group is, oh yeah, great. We have tools. We have a lot of tools.
Marketing loves their tools, right?
They do. I mean, marketing's tied into, they've got their email list, they've got social media, they've got, case studies, they've got short form videos and social media posts and all sorts of stuff. So they've got all kinds of content and all kinds of tools that you can use. So this is a great opportunity where you are partnering with your marketing team to put together the right tools to use. And there's emails, calls, social media, like I said, all that stuff, right?
And one thing I want to point out is that you mentioned the marketing list of 2,500 names, and then the Doer-Sellers who are taking a handful of names and a manageable list for them to do prospecting with. I think it's important to note that when you're doing this kind of prospecting, to make sure that marketing understands that those particular prospects are in a sequence at a certain time, so that the marketing team can make sure that they do or do not receive other communications that may or may not impact your prospecting. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, fair. I've come across that in the past. Hopefully, if you've really done this well, they work in concert,
exactly,
with one another. Yeah, all these different tools need to come together in some logical sort of fashion. So the last part of this, we talked about the targets, these groups that you're going to do some proactive outreach to, the different tools. There's all kinds of them, all kinds of different tools. And then there's the technique, which is the third one. The technique is how you take these groups and overlay all these tools, case studies and other types of content, social media, even the telephone. We can weave that in. How you take all of these tools and use them in a logical sequence. So one of the things with your technique, one of the things you want to do in this sequence is you want to pull sort of a consistent thread of content from beginning to end, right? Your first social media touch with them where you're mentioning some specific topic should make sense when you send the email, and then ultimately when you maybe try to call them and leave them a voicemail. All those things should be tied together in some way. It's not the exact same message, but they should be tied together with some consistent content thread or some consistent piece of information. Sequences are made up of multiple touches. It can be a light touch on social media, a follow or a connection or whatever else, all the way to where you're desiring to have a telephone conversation with someone. They usually are put together in sort of an increasing intensity, meaning there's a social media interaction all the way to, like I said, like a phone call. And this sequence of potential interactions should be put together in a tight but reasonable cadence so that the person doesn't lose track of it. You don't lose track of it, right? You've got this one person that you're targeting. You've got this sequence that you're using. This consistent thread of content is woven throughout your different touches. So they're starting to connect you and this information and the content. So it all makes sense. So it needs to all tie in together. And practically, when I recommend that people undertake this sequence, I recommend that people pick one group. Okay, there's this specific group of 5 people that I'm going to target. I recommend they use one tool and they use that one tool in one specific time block. So this is sort of a practical application of this technique. It's okay, so I've got 5 people. I'm going to take 30 minutes on Thursday in my time block there, and I'm going to send out the email in that one time block. Now, the reason I say this is that what you want to avoid is having 2 different groups of people where you're sending 3 emails and making 6 phone calls and then doing 4 social media touches. It all gets way too confusing to the point where someone just gives up. From a practical standpoint, the whole sort of technique on this is keep it simple, focus on one group, use one specific tool, and do it in one specific time block. Do it all together.
Yeah. It's like you're batching like tasks together.
Yep.
Yeah, it's making it easy for you.
Exactly. So we teased it at the beginning, but let's run through a quick sort of 14-day sequence that, again, this isn't really specific. It's more general in nature. I think individuals should absolutely build and then practice and test their own sort of outreach sequences. But this is an example of one.
I think it would be helpful for folks that are listening to this, Mark. You mentioned how there's different touch points and they increase in intensity as you go along. So I think if you were to just kind of walk through this, it would be really helpful.
Good. So we got 14 days ahead of us, right? You're going to find this one group of people, maybe you got 5 or 6 people or so. At the beginning of this, obviously, you want to do your research and you want to develop your list and your content. So that's day 1, you do your research. Day 2, let's do a social media touch. And a social media touch can be just about anything. John, you and I are fans of LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, you can follow individuals, you can connect with them, you can message them, all those things. And we've done a podcast episode on LinkedIn. So tune into that one for some ideas there. So day 2, social media touch. Maybe it's LinkedIn. Maybe it's like I said, it's a connection request or commenting on someone's post or whatever it is. 3 days later, day 5, maybe you've kind of commented on something they've written on LinkedIn. Now we're going to connect with them. Now you're going to send them that connection request, which kind of gets you onto their radar that says, okay, hey, so-and-so wants to connect with you. They're obviously interested. Hey, I'd love to connect. I love what you're doing on social media. Let's connect here. 4 days later, day 9, you're going to send them an email, right? And it's just a really quick email. Hey, I'm interested to learn more. We connected on LinkedIn recently. I'd love to learn more about your organization. I'm unfamiliar with the specifics of your organization. So I'd love to see if you'd be up for a conversation. 4 days later, if nothing's come of that yet, we've got this 4th touch, which is a telephone call, right? So you've hopefully got their telephone numbers are sometimes easy and sometimes not. And a lot of times when you call people, you're going to get their voicemail, right? So you're going to call and you're going to have a voicemail script ready to go. And it's just simply, hey, I thought I'd give this a shot. I've sent you a couple other communications and I wanted to try to reach out on the telephone. You know, who knows? Sometimes having a nice, pleasant, brief conversation on the phone is fine. If you'd be willing to schedule a conversation with me, that would be great. So there's that touch. And then immediately after that, you send a follow-up email and says, hey, it's Mark. I just left you a voicemail. No big deal. If this is not of interest to you and is not something that you want to pursue, that's totally fine. Just send me a quick note and we'll call it done. But if so, let's find some time to talk. So boom, boom, boom. There's kind of 4 or 5 touches right there. And doing that all over the course of 2 weeks keeps it concentrated. Let's one interaction logically lead to the next, that leads to the next, that leads to the next, and they're not disjointed so we don't lose track of them. So there you go, 2 weeks.
I like that. I like that flow. And it's because it's concentrated to 2 weeks, and because you've got you have a manageable list, it makes it so that it can be executed by a doer-seller.
Yeah.
And that it's predictable. So we expect that we start to have conversations by the end of the month if we start to implement this today.
Yeah, that's the hope. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe you'll get a conversation or maybe you won't. But you've learned something. You've definitely learned something through this whole process. And at the least, you've increased some level of familiarity with you and your organization, right? So boom, there's those 3, right? Maybe you didn't get in it, you get the call, get the conversation. But hopefully you've done your research and learned some stuff, and then they've learned a little bit about you, sort of passively, right?
Yeah. And then from pipeline analytics, you can take a look at how many different prospects it takes to get to a conversation, and then you can start kind of building that out and layering that into your workflows.
Good. Well, I hope that people can, give it a shot. Prospecting is a challenge, but well worth it. And like I mentioned earlier, a way that people can, be sort of self-determinant in this often messy sort of marketing and sales thing, and they can kind of take control of it. So I hope it's useful.
Excellent. Mark, thank you so much for breaking down prospecting for business development. I'm sure our listeners got a ton of value out of it. So if folks have made it this far, please rate, review, subscribe to the show, and we'll talk to you next time.
Perfect. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.